Let me describe a conversation that happens in churches everywhere, probably every week. Two people see each other in the lobby on Sunday morning. The first one says, "Hey, how you been doing, man?" And the second one, without even a pause to actually consider the question, says, "Yeah, I'm busy, man. So busy. I don't know where the time goes. It's been absolutely crazy. But it's good. It's a good busy. You know what I'm saying? There's just a lot of going on." First person nods, yeah, because they feel exactly the same way. And they say, "I know, me too. It's a lot, isn't it?" And they part their ways, both of them slightly validated, because in that exchange, something was confirmed, something that our culture, including our church cultures, has quietly agreed upon. That being, busy means you're doing something worthwhile. That exhaustion is the currency of what it means to be significant, or to actually be doing something important. That maybe if you're not stretched thin, you're probably not doing enough. So we built an entire spiritual identity around being needed, and almost none of us have stopped long enough to ask whether that identity is really biblical. Well, welcome back to Radiant Hope. This is episode number 7 of the quiet sins no one talks about. And we're continuing on in the series. And today we're addressing something so pervasive, so normalized, and so thoroughly embedded in Christian culture that it barely registers a problem. In fact, it tends to be rewarded. Today we're talking about busyness as a badge of faithfulness, when exhaustion becomes evidence of godliness. Let me start with the honest question. Why does busyness feel so right? Because it does feel right. It feels productive. It feels faithful. It feels like the opposite of sloth, which is an actual sin in the Bible. It feels like what a serious Christian should look like. Someone whose calendar is full, whose commitments are many, whose gifts are being used, whose presence is required. And underneath all of that is a feeling that I want to name carefully. Being needed feels at a visceral level like being loved, or at least being valuable, like having a place in the world that cannot be filled by someone else. We feel special. Now, there's nothing wrong with contributing, with being useful, with bringing your gifts to bear in the world and the church. Those things are genuinely good, but here's the theological problem that hides inside the feeling of being needed. It locates our worth in our output. It says, not out loud maybe, but functionally, that we matter because of what we do. That our value is measured in what we produce, how or who requires us, how full the schedule is. And the gospel says something really categorically different. The gospel says that we are loved before we do anything. That we're valued not as workers, but as children. That our worth is established entirely outside of our performance by the work of another. Ephesians 2:8-9 says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works." See, the busy Christian has often in practice reversed that order. Not in their theology, and they can tell you, the doctrine of grace. They got that down. That's not really that big of a deal, right? They get that. Their peace requires, though, productivity. Their sense of God's pleasure is tied to the fullness of their calendar. If they stop, they feel guilty. If they rest, they feel like they're falling behind, which also somehow a way of letting God down. John Calvin, writing on the Sabbath commandment, recognized that the impulse to endless productivity was not merely a cultural problem, but a spiritual one rooted in a failure to trust. He said, "The man who cannot rest has not yet learned to trust God with the hours he is not filling. He imagines that the work will not go on without him," which is to say, he imagines himself more necessary to the work than God is. This is not diligence. It is a subtle form of practical unbelief. And John Calvin wrote that in his Institutes. So he said that this is the theological location of the busyness problem, right? It is not at its root about time management. It's about where we have actually placed our confidence. Now, Richard Baxter, who wrote over 160 books, was by any measure a highly productive man. Nevertheless, he wrote about the temptation to confuse industry with faithfulness. He said, I have known men who were busy in God's service, who were in truth busier in their own, for they had confused the sanctification or the satisfaction of being useful with the surrender of being obedient. The useful man and the obedient man are not always the same. And Richard Baxter should know, right? He's writing all these books. So that's actually probably something we should stop and think about, what he just said. Because much of what fills the Christian calendar is really good. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. There's teaching, serving, giving, organizing, caring for people. None of it's obviously wrong, and yet busyness can be assembled entirely from good things while still being a way of running from the most important one. I mean, Mary and Martha is the main story here about this. In Luke 10:38 through 42, Jesus is at their home and Martha is busy with all the preparation, which is good, which is hospitable, which is the right thing to do in ordinary circumstances. And she's frustrated with her sister, who is simply sitting at Jesus' feet. And Jesus says, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her. So she was troubled, anxious, and troubled about many things. Notice that Jesus does not rebuke Martha for being useful. He identifies that her usefulness has become a source of anxiety, a competitor with his presence, a way of being in the same room as Jesus, but at the same time not actually being with Jesus. The busy Christian can fill a room with activity and never quite be present with the person who is also in the room. Now, I want to go deeper because I think busyness is rarely a single thing. It wears different faces and different people, and if we only address the surface, we leave the root untouched. There are at least 3 things that busyness commonly conceals. Maybe not in every person, but these are worth holding up as kind of diagnostic mirrors. So first thing is busyness as avoidance. The first one busyness can hide that avoidance in us. The deliberate, often unconscious filling of time so that certain things cannot be faced. That's what we're talking about. The marriage that is struggling, but there is always another commitment that makes the hard conversation impossible to schedule. The grief that has not been processed because slowing down would mean feeling it. The spiritual dryness that has gone unaddressed for months because addressing it would mean sitting in silence long enough to notice it. Maybe the nagging question about a decision made years ago that tends to surface whenever the noise drops. Busyness is extraordinarily effective at keeping noise at a level that prevents these things from rising. And it has the additional advantage of being respectable. When you're busy with good things, no one asks you why you aren't sitting still. Thomas Watson named this instinct in his writing on self-examination. He said, "Many a man fills his days with virtuous industry so that he may never be required to sit in judgment on himself. Activity is the great enemy of self-knowledge, for the soul that is always in motion rarely looks in the mirror." This is the avoidance function of busyness in a single sentence. And it's worth asking honestly, is there something in your life that your schedule is currently protecting you from having to face? The second one is busyness as pride. The pride of being indispensable, of being the person the operation cannot function with, of having a life so full of significant activity that significance itself seems confirmed. There's a particular flavor of this in ministry context. The pastor who's always available, always reachable, always carrying more than any reasonable person should, and who resents quietly the suggestion that someone could handle some of it. The church volunteer who has her hands in every committee and bristles slightly when a new person offers to take something over. The ministry leader who can train someone to do what he does, but somehow never quite gets around to it. Take Charles Spurgeon. He knew this temptation intimately and paid for it in extended seasons of physical and psychological collapse. And he was blunt about it. He said, "Beware of the busy man who's never quite sure the work would go on without him. He may call it dedication. His maker calls it something else. There is a self that is being served in all that serving, and it is a demanding and an ungrateful master." So the pride of busyness is doubly difficult to address because it looks, at every point, like sacrifice. The person carrying too much appears to be the most generous person in the room. In some ways they are, but generosity and pride can occupy the same act, and it's worth asking which one is driving what I'm doing. The third thing that busyness can conceal is fear. Specifically, the fear of what we would find if we're still. Psalm 46:10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." That verse is quoted mostly as comfort, as an invitation to peace, right? But I want to suggest that for many people, the first half of the sentence is genuinely frightening. Be still. To be still is to be alone with yourself and with God. And to be alone with yourself, for the chronically busy person, is to be alone with the questions, the doubts, the unresolved things, the whisper that maybe you're not who you appear to be. Maybe God is not as close as the calendar suggests. Busyness keeps those things at a safe distance. It creates a perpetual forward momentum that makes stillness feel like stopping, like falling behind, like in some dimly perceived way of actually spiritually dying. Jonathan Edwards, in his famous Resolutions, written as a young man, included the remarkable entry about the fear of stillness. He said, "Resolved to examine rigorously why it is that I find it easier to work for God than to sit with God. For I suspect there is in my preference for labor over rest, a fear that rest would reveal something I am not willing to see." Now that is an honest and searching self-examination from a man of really extraordinary gifts and output if you look how much he wrote. The busyness was real for him. The fruit was also real. And yet Edwards was suspicious of his own preference for it, because he recognized that sustained activity could function as a wall against the very intimacy he claimed to serve. Let me turn you now to the most countercultural thing I want to say in this episode, and it is also, I think, the most hopeful. Talk about the Sabbath. The Sabbath is not primarily a command about time management, right? It's a theological statement about who is responsible for the world. Exodus 20:8-11 grounds the Sabbath commandment in creation. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. God did not rest on the seventh day because he was tired. He's omnipotent. He doesn't grow weary. He rested, he ceased as a declaration, as a statement that the work was complete, that it was good, and that it would be entrusted. When God commands his people to rest, he is commanding them to participate in that declaration, to stop once in 7 days and enact with their bodies and their schedules the theological condition or conviction that the world does not depend on their activity to continue. That God was at work before they began their day and will be at work after they end it. That the harvest is his. That the results are his. That the keeping of everything they love most is his. Psalm 127:2 says, "It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives sleep to his beloved." There's a kind of work that is offered to God and a kind of work that is consumed by anxiety. The difference is not in the activity, it's in the posture of the hands doing it. Open hands, working and releasing what has been created. Or closed fists, working and gripping onto the thing. So Sabbath is the practice of open hands. It is weekly enacted confession that I am not God, that the work is not mine to control, that rest is not irresponsibility, but trust, made real, made physical. Walter Chantry rooted the practice directly in faith. He said, "The man who will not keep the Sabbath has not yet believed that God is sufficient for the hours he rests. He thinks the world will slip while he's not watching. But the world does not slip. The Sabbath keeper testifies to this with his body. I am not the axis in which this turns." That's not a confession of insignificance, right? It is a confession of right order. You matter. Your work matters. But God is larger than both. So practically, what does recovering Sabbath look like for someone who has made busyness a badge of life? Probably does not look like a perfect, liturgically precise day of rest beginning at sundown. For most people in most seasons, it really begins much more modestly. It might begin with 1 hour a week that is genuinely, deliberately unscheduled. It's not productive. It's not educational. It's not optimized. It's just stopped. Just letting the world run without your assistance for 60 minutes. And in that hour, in the discomfort of that stillness, in the itch of the undone task, paying attention to what rises up out of that. Because what rises will tell you something important about what your busyness has been protecting you from. What you find there can be brought, honestly, to the one who says in Matthew 11:28, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Not manage your rest, not optimize your rest. Give it to me. So I want to say something directly to the people who are listening to this while they're in the middle of a season that genuinely does not have a margin to it. Because those seasons are real. There are stretches of parenting, of illness, of work, of crisis that do not offer the luxury of a quiet hour or a clear Sabbath. I know that, and you know that too. This episode's not a guilt trip for people who are simply in a hard season, right? But I want to ask a different question. When the hard season ends, and it will end, what will you return to? Will you return to rest? Or will you discover that the hard season has become the new normal? Because busyness has quietly filled every space that opened up. The question to ask is not just how do I rest? It is what would I have to believe about God to actually stop? Because the Sabbath is ultimately a faith question. It asks, do you believe he is sufficient? Do you trust that the work will continue, that the people who you love are being held by him? And, do you believe that your worth does not depend on your output? Do you believe, not just as a doctrine, but as a lived reality, that you're not the main character? John Owen, near the end of his life, wrote with the perspective of a man who had produced an enormous body of work, yet understood what could not be produced. Listen to what he says. "I have learned later than I ought to have that the hours I spent in rest were not hours stolen from God's service, but hours given back to me by his mercy, that I might return to the work as one who has been with God, and not merely one who has been working for him." So that's an invitation, right? And it's not an invitation to do less, but actually to do more. Being more present with God, more rooted in him, more genuinely alive to the one you're actually doing all this for. So I want to give you one reminder and one question to carry you into your week. Here's the reminder. You can stop. The world will continue. The work will be there when you get back. The God who holds everything is not waiting anxiously for you to go back to your work. He's not waiting there just, I hope he gets back to work real soon, because I don't know if I can hold this together. No. And here's the question. What would you find if you were still long enough to find it? If you just calmed yourself down, if you just were still and know God, what would you find there? You don't have to be afraid of the answer. The one waiting in that stillness is your Father, and he gives sleep to his beloved. Think about that. What would you find there? What have you found there? Well, until next time, walk humbly, think biblically, and rest in the steady hope God provides.